We like to believe we're in complete control of our own destinies, writing our own stories one page at a time. But the reality is that every single day our lives are shaped by a web of choices, accidents, and random events. And every once in a while, history leaves behind something else, an unsettling glitch that suggests our script might have already been written for us. From a legendary author who mapped out a real-world tragedy decades before it happened, to a rock icon who handwrote his own eulogy on a commercial flight, the stories on this episode are either the ultimate statistical anomalies, or they're proof that some minds can occasionally reach through the fabric of time and touch the future. Grab a seat by the fire as we explore the strange reality of dreams and premonitions on Fireside Unsolved, episode 250, 5 Strange Predictions That Actually Came True. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only completed novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. The book was a dark psychological sea adventure detailing a mutiny and a catastrophic shipwreck. In the story, Poe writes about an unsettling sequence of events. Stranded on a drifting hull of a boat in the middle of the ocean, 4 starving survivors realize they are days away from death. They make the decision to do the unthinkable. They were so desperate to stay alive that they drew straws to decide who would be sacrificed as a food source, so the other 3 had at least a chance to survive. In the book, the short straw goes to a young cabin boy named Richard Parker. He's killed and his crewmates survive off his remains until they're eventually rescued. When the book was published, critics completely trashed the storyline, calling it a sensationalized work of pure fiction. But 46 years later, the fiction became a terrifying reality. In the summer of 1884, an English luxury yacht named the Mignonette sank during a bad storm in the South Atlantic, going under in a matter of minutes. 4 crew members managed to scramble into a tiny 13-foot wooden lifeboat. They had 0 fresh water, and their only food was 2 small tins of turnips. By the 19th day of drifting under a scorching sun, the men were delirious from dehydration and starvation. The captain, Tom Dudley, suggested they draw straws to see who should be sacrificed, so the others could live. One crew member refused, so they dropped the idea. But the very next day, looking at their 17-year-old cabin boy who was slipping into a coma after drinking seawater, the remaining crew made a choice. They killed the boy, used his remains to survive for 4 more days, and were finally picked up by a passing German ship. When the survivors got back to England, they didn't even try to hide what they'd done. They truly believed they were protected by the unwritten rules of survival, but that wasn't the case. Instead, they were immediately arrested and put on trial for a landmark murder case that completely changed maritime law. But it wasn't until newspapers printed the details of the case that the public collectively lost its mind. Because the real-life cabin boy who was sacrificed in the South Atlantic wasn't just a nameless victim. His name was Richard Parker. The exact same name, the exact same job, and the exact same horrifying fate that Edgar Allan Poe had written down nearly half a century before. It's the kind of coincidence that genuinely gives you goosebumps. So was Edgar Allan Poe somehow tapped into some dark loop of human tragedy? Or did the master of horror accidentally document a real-world nightmare, decades before the boy who lived it was even born? In 1726, the Irish author Jonathan Swift published Gulliver's Travels. While most people remember the book for its tiny people and giant kingdoms, one specific chapter takes Gulliver to a bizarre, floating island of scientists and academics called Laputa. The Laputan astronomers are described as being obsessed with the night sky. They spent their days looking through telescopes that were far more advanced than anything available in Europe in the 18th century. And in the text, Swift casually drops a random, hyper-specific detail. He writes that they discovered something completely unknown to real-world science, that Mars is orbited by exactly 2 tiny, tightly bound moons. But Swift didn't just guess the number. He went on to describe their exact orbits. He wrote that the inner moon orbits around the red planet every 10 hours, while the outer moon orbit takes 21.5 hours. To the scientific community in the first half of the 1700s, this was just a quirky, imaginative detail. And for a very simple reason. According to the world's best scientists, Mars didn't have any moons. During Swift's lifetime, the telescopes used by royal observatories across Europe simply weren't powerful enough to see small objects orbiting distant planets. For generations, the consensus was that Mars was a lonely, solitary planet, until the summer of 1877. 151 years after Gulliver's Travels was printed, an American astronomer named Asaph Hall was working late at the U.S. Naval Observatory. Looking through a giant state-of-the-art telescope on a clear August night, he spotted a tiny speck of light cutting through the glare of Mars. A few nights later, he found a second one. Mars did in fact have two moons, which we now know as Phobos and Deimos. But the real shock hit the scientific community when they calculated the math on how these moons move. The inner moon, Phobos, whips around Mars in just over 7.5 hours. The outer moon, Deimos, takes about 30. Now compare those to Swift's numbers from a century and a half earlier, 10 hours and 21 hours. In the infinite scale of space, those numbers are incredibly, eerily close. To this day, historians explain this away as a massive stroke of luck. They argue that Swift was just playing a guessing game using a flawed mathematical theory left behind by Johannes Kepler. Swift somehow nailed the highly unusual physics of a deep space environment he should have known nothing about. Did he just hit the ultimate cosmic lottery? Or was Jonathan Swift looking through a window to the stars that history has completely forgotten? In early April 1865, a small group gathered in the private quarters of the White House. Among them were First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln and the president's close friend and legal partner Ward Hill Layman. The atmosphere in the room shifted from casual conversation to a heavy, stunned silence as President Abraham Lincoln decided to recount a vivid, unsettling nightmare he'd had a few nights before. Lincoln explained that in his dream, he was asleep when he was suddenly shocked awake by the sound of distant, mournful sobbing. He got out of bed and started wandering through the corridors of the White House, trying to figure out where the crying was coming from. But as he moved from room to room, every single space was completely deserted, even though the sound of weeping continued to echo all around him. Finally, Lincoln walked into the East Room, and what he saw there stopped him dead in his tracks. Resting right in the center of the room was a catafalque, a raised platform draped in black funeral cloth, supporting a corpse wrapped in burial vestments. The face of the body was covered, but a large crowd of citizens and soldiers stood gathered around it, weeping. In the dream, Lincoln walked up to one of the soldiers standing guard and asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier looked him in the eye and said, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln told his friends he woke up in a cold sweat the second the soldier spoke, unable to shake how terrifyingly real it felt. Mary Todd Lincoln was visibly horrified by the story, but the president tried to comfort her, chalking the nightmare up to a psychological reaction to the stress of the newly finished Civil War. But his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. Less than 2 weeks later, on the evening of April 14th, Lincoln was sitting in a rocking chair inside a balcony box at Ford's Theater. A fanatical actor named John Wilkes Booth slipped through the unlocked door, drew a single-shot pistol, and fired a bullet into the back of the president's head. Lincoln passed away early the next morning. When his body was brought back to the White House to prepare for a national funeral train, staff members set up a massive, black-draped platform to hold the casket so a grieving public could say goodbye. They placed the catafalque precisely in the center of the East Room. The room was filled with the exact same mournful sobbing, the exact same guard details, and the exact same tragic reality that Abraham Lincoln had walked through in his sleep just days earlier. Maybe it was just the trauma of leading a fractured nation that opened up some kind of psychological doorway for Lincoln, letting him peek into his own fate. Or was his final nightmare a literal internal warning system, a silent, desperate alarm that went ignored until it was already too late? Way back in 1865, an entire century before we had the technology to actually make it happen, French writer Jules Verne published a sci-fi novel called From the Earth to the Moon. The book followed a group of post-Civil War weapons experts who decided to build a giant cannon capable of firing a hollow manned capsule straight to the lunar surface. For decades, the book was celebrated as a beautifully written piece of fantasy. But when NASA actually managed to land a man on the moon in July of 1969, historians took a closer look at Verne's old novel and realized something shocking. Jules Verne hadn't just dreamed up a cool space story. He had somehow mathematically mapped out the actual parameters of the Apollo 11 mission with incredible accuracy. For starters, he had calculated that in order to break free from Earth's gravity, The spacecraft needed to launch from a peninsula and as close to the equator as possible to take advantage of the planet's natural spin. In his book, he picked Tampa, Florida. 104 years later, Apollo 11 launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, just a short drive across that exact same peninsula. Then look at the actual spaceship. Verne wrote that to survive the vacuum of space while staying light enough to launch, the capsule had to be built out of a newly commercialized lightweight metal, aluminum. NASA ended up building the Apollo 11 command module out of an aluminum alloy. Jules wrote that in this vessel, there would be 3 men on board. Apollo 11 carried 3 astronauts as well. And in a detail that sounds completely made up, Jules Verne named his fictional spacecraft the Columbiad. NASA named the Apollo 11 command module Columbia. But the parallels get even weirder when you look at how the mission ended. After slingshotting around the moon, Verne's fictional astronauts head home by flying back through the atmosphere and splashing down in the Pacific Ocean, where they're picked up by a U.S. Navy ship. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins splashed down in the Pacific and were rescued by the USS Hornet. Now, skeptics point out that Jules was a huge science nerd who read academic journals and constantly talked to mathematicians to keep his stories grounded. They argue that if you understand basic orbital mechanics, you can logically figure out the best launch sites and angles. But basic physics doesn't choose the name of the ship, the exact number of the crew, or the precise ocean for a splashdown. Maybe Jules Verne just possessed one of the most brilliant analytical minds in human history, capable of reverse engineering the space program in the 19th century. Or maybe his pen was guided by a strange foresight that drew up the blueprint for the space age, long before we were ready to blast off. In 1967, an up-and-coming guitar player boarded a commercial flight operated by Braniff International Airlines. Like most musicians, he was hit by a sudden burst of inspiration, but he didn't have a notebook handy. He reached into the seatback pocket and pulled out a sheet of the airline's official stationery. Taking out a pen, he started frantically writing out lyrics that would change rock history. The guitarist was Jimi Hendrix, and the song he was drafting on that airline paper was his masterpiece, Purple Haze. Most of the lines he scribbled down that day became iconic anthems for an entire generation. But at the bottom of the page was an alternative verse that Hendrix ultimately decided to cut from the final studio track. It was a deeply poetic, almost mournful reflection. On the airline stationery, he wrote, "The story of life is quicker than the wink of an eye. The story of love is hello and goodbye, until we meet again." Once the track was finished, that rough draft was put into a private collection, and those lyrics were forgotten as Hendrix exploded into a global superstar. Over the next 3 years, Hendrix completely redefined what an electric guitar could do, but the blinding speed of his rise to fame seemed to mirror the very words he had written on that plane. On the night of September 17, 1970, Hendrix was staying at an apartment in London. Late that evening, he sat down with a notepad and spent hours writing a frantic multi-page poem, leaving the sheets resting on a table before finally going to sleep. Tragically, Hendrix would never wake up. He passed away early the next morning at just 27 years old. When his friends and investigators later recovered the notepad from the room, they realized they were looking at the very last words he would ever leave behind on this earth. The poem was titled, "The Story of Life." Written in ink just hours before his heart stopped beating were the exact same lines he had put onto the airline stationery 3 years earlier. "The story of life is quicker than the wink of an eye. The story of love is hello and goodbye, until we meet again." At the very least, it's a bone-chilling poetic coincidence that has left music historians stunned for decades. Was Jimi Hendrix simply recycling an old, beautiful lyric that had been floating around in the back of his mind? Or had the legendary musician somehow stepped onto that airplane in 1967, looked far into his own future, and perfectly written his own eulogy, years before the world was ready to say goodbye?
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fireside Unsolved. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Until next time, take it easy and be easy, you filthy bastards.